A wonderful speech can be ruined by a lousy question and answer period, or Q&A period. But when done effectively, a great speech turns into an even greater experience for the audience. So the key is to prepare for the Q&A period in a way that builds your credibility rather than breaks it. And the following 8 keys will help you do just that. By the way, never close your speech with the Q&A period. Never close your speech with the Q&A period. Don't worry, you'll pick that up in speaking tip number 38. Here are your 8 keys. Number 1, set expectations as to how many questions you'll take or how long you'll entertain questions. For example, I usually say something like, we'll take 4 or 5 questions here and then I'll wrap up my message. Or I might say, we have 5 minutes for questions and answers and then we'll put a bow on the message for today. Now, along with setting expectations, you should also let your audience know that this is not the end of the presentation. And that's why I add, and then we'll wrap up the message. Otherwise, because audiences are so used to speakers ending with the Q&A, they might think you're at the end, which could easily prompt them to start packing up their papers and shuffling around in anticipation of leaving. And, of course, that can be disruptive. You can solve this problem by setting the expectations at the beginning of the Q&A. Key number 2 is, don't ask, do you have any questions? Or, are there any questions? People might not respond. Instead, ask an open-ended question like, what questions do you have? See, this is no longer about whether or not they have a question. It's about what questions they have and how many. And believe me, questions will flow out if you prompt them in an open-ended way rather than using the yes or no question. On that note, make sure you tell your audience members at the beginning of your program that you'll be taking questions toward the end of your program. And this stimulates them to think of questions the whole time because they understand that they'll have the opportunity to ask them. And if you don't let them know early on, guess what? You'll be stuck with silence once you get to what questions they have. All right, so that's key number 2. Key number 3 is to rephrase the questions. This accomplishes 3 things. Number 1, it affirms the person who asked the question and makes him or her feel understood. Secondly, it helps the other audience members understand what was asked, because lots of times the questioners don't have a microphone and the audience can't hear them as well. And number 3, it gives you time to formulate your response. So key number 3 is to rephrase the question. It will do wonders for you. Key 4, frame your responses. For example, if it's going to be a 3-part response, let them know. You might say something like, there are 3 critical strategies you can use. First, blah, blah, blah. Second, blah, blah, blah. And finally, blah, blah, blah. See, this way, even if you do speak a little longer than you want, it won't feel like you're rambling because it will be structured. Key number 5 is to make sure your answers are brief. Okay? You really want to anticipate what they'll ask you, and you want to prepare for those answers in advance. Because I found something when it comes to speaking. The longer you take to answer, the quicker they'll stop believing you. You know, those short answers that you give that are punchy and to the point, those are memorable. So make sure your answers are brief. Key number 6 is you want to try to call on questioners from all 4 major sections of your audience. You want to call on people in the front, people in the back, people to the left, people to your right, and make them all feel involved. And also, don't just call on the friendly faces. All right, key number 7 is to acknowledge the importance or validity of the question. Sometimes. Now, I know there are some speakers who say, don't tell people they asked a good question because then everybody else in the audience that you didn't say that to will get offended. Well, I got to be honest here. Let them be offended. You know, if somebody gets offended because you praised another person, that's their personal problem, not yours. So occasionally saying, great question, does much more good than harm. But only say it if you mean it, right? And then key number 8 is occasionally ask, does that make sense? Don't overdo this, but do use it, especially if you're not sure you address the person's question adequately, or you have read some kind of uncertainty on the person's face. It doesn't hurt to check. So here are some final thoughts on the 8 keys to an effective session. If you incorporate these 8 keys into your question and answer period, and remember you never close with a question and answer period, believe me, you will deepen your connection with each response, and you'll do it without destroying the flow of your speech. That's how you build credibility with the Q&A. Talk to you next week. Until then, keep speaking up.